Developing the moon, while it may sound exciting, is without a doubt an incredibly difficult and daunting task, and if one is unfocused and obscure in their purpose and plan, will not get done. And that is exactly what my opponent was in her positive affirmation towards the development of the moon in either the areas of mineral, water, or energy resources. Her plan was unsure, her plan was vague, and if it was voted on, would not be accomplished within a reasonable time. It would take just far too long to do. And that is what I'll be arguing and trying to highlight the areas which I feel were the weakest points of it and adding my own opinion and acknowledgments towards what I believe would make it a stronger argument. Starting off with her resolution analysis, just that on its own was far too much background information. It took far too long to get to the actual point on itself and just didn't really have a plan on its own. Again, it was almost, I believe it was 2 minutes just that on its own, maybe more closer to a minute and a half, but just maybe want to focus in on that a little bit more and get more to the point so there could be more room for information that would be beneficial towards your case. And then next, going to where my opponent mentioned China's advancements with the lunar explorations and the H3. Again, while that sounds amazing and is great for China, it had nothing really to do towards the argument that the US needs to do this on their own, and kind of just highlighted what China was doing without really telling anything towards us. And I don't know, maybe we'll try to tie that into how that would be relevant to the USA. Like, was it maybe done in a way to maybe motivate the US on itself? Like, hey, you're getting kind of behind on this. You might want to pick that up. I don't know. That's really the only thing that I could see from that. And just kind of, again, like I said, wasn't really tied in well towards what the actual argument itself was. Going next to point 3, developing the moon is reasonable. My opponent mentioned that there are projects that could be done that would make lunar travel and lunar developments a more attractive thing on its own, with more like cost beneficial things towards us, I believe was mentioned. But that's really all that was mentioned, and what I would have to say is, what exactly are these projects that you were talking about? They were touched on and they sounded on their own kind of interesting, but again, weren't really mentioned anymore besides that, and just kind of got skipped over towards the next argument that you're making. Like, how exactly would these be beneficial? And like I said, if funding for this was going to be happening, it would be in massive, massive amounts. And if we're spending all this money, we would kind of want to have a more clear-cut image of where this money's going to and how soon after we could see more so what positives would be done for us and how we'd be making that money back. And just overall, that point itself was kind of vague. Just, yeah, maybe we'll put a little more detail into that, or just kind of a clear-cut explanation of it. And as far as subpoint A goes, explaining that the moon is a diving board, my opponent was mentioning how by getting onto the moon, we could then use that as kind of a springboard towards the next lunar exploration, towards maybe Mars, or maybe harvesting an asteroid, or creating whatever we were going to do after that. Which, again, sounds amazing, but I don't see how that would be really good to focus on and kind of be looking in all those different directions when we haven't even really gotten to the moon yet. And that's what the whole thing that we're arguing right now. So I feel like that point on its own would be good in its own argument, but in the one that we're making, just kind of distracted from what the main purpose was of it. We should kind of be more focusing our attention towards the lunar goal on its own, because that itself will take however many years it'll take. Like, while going to Mars would sound fun, that takes far more time than it would be for the moon. And focusing our attention towards both those would just make both of them take even longer. So, like I said, we would want more so kind of try and keep our vision focused and try and see exactly what the goal is that we want to do here. And then once we've accomplished that goal of settling on the moon and gathering those resources for the moon and bringing those resources back towards us, then we can kind of maybe focus our attention towards what the next goal would be. Like, I don't know, you learn to walk before you can run. You can't really get to Mars without getting to the moon first, but we need to get to the moon first. So that's the main point that I'm trying to make there. Just maybe focus one thing at a time. And then the final point that I'd like to be making is how my opponent mentioned cislunar space, which is the space that is located between the moon's atmosphere and the Earth's atmosphere, which is not too much space, but the actual name for it is cislunar space. And my opponent mentioned that if we do travel to the moon, then we could kind of, after that, have a much easier way of getting in that space in between and kind of establishing a channel between whatever country would be using that one and just like figuring out what we could do with all that area there, like make it good for space travel or whatever, which again, it will become very useful to understand what cislunar space is and kind of set those boundaries and see exactly what we could do with that. But like I've mentioned before, it has nothing to do with the development of the moon and the argument that we're trying to make now on water, energy, and or minerals. So, like I was saying, it's distracting from the original argument on its own, and because of that, I feel like it's kind of a hindrance towards what the original goal would be. So, it just cannot really be used to support the claim that she's making now, and just on its own was not really beneficial or useful information to be giving towards the audience that we were giving it towards. It's just kind of a whole different area of funding and a whole different area of development. So, tying back to my original point, that on its own, along with the other few points that I mentioned, did kind of make this case more vague and kind of unfocused, which the case was good. I did understand what was trying to be said, but just on the way to getting to point A to point Z in the argument, there was just too much kind of filler information and kind of just not really necessary towards the main point that was being made. And besides that, that is my negative affirmation towards this case. Thank you.